Ja, vielen Dank. Ich möchte mich zunächst mal auf Deutsch für die freundliche Einladung ganz herzlich bedanken. Es ist mir just 1 minute in German and then I'm switching into English. No worries back then. Es ist mir eine große Ehre, hier und heute einen Vortrag halten zu dürfen. Als Kantianer habe ich schon lange nach dieser Stadt gesehnt. Habe ich mir schon lange nach dieser Stadt gesehnt. Ich kann mir kaum eine bessere Gelegenheit vorstellen, endlich hier zu kommen, wo alles begonnen hat. So I'm switching into English now for my paper, and just to make people not worry anymore. So topic of my paper is Kant calls common moral rational cognition. Kant's distinctive version of moral rationalism can helpfully be investigated from the vantage point of its method. Here I understand method in the most classical terms, as the path that leads to philosophical inquiry from a certain starting point to its intended aim. The significance of methodological issues in moral philosophy is especially apparent from the very beginning in the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. Kant's remarks concerning the analytical way of proceeding in the inquiry in a first part of the work, as opposed to the synthetic nature of a second part, pursue a double aim. First, Kant thereby intended to clarify a certain methodological homogeneity of the groundwork with both the first critique and the prolegomena. Secondly, those remarks spelled out the starting point and the main goal of the inquiry, differentiating Kant's project in moral philosophy from other approaches. I shall focus on the latter aspect, with the broader aim of shedding some light on some features of Kant's view in the groundwork and beyond. I shall argue that Kant's project in moral philosophy is characterized by a specific conception of the proper beginning and the aim of a philosophical inquiry on morals, that this conception has often been distorted, and that Kant's moral rationalism is different not only from prior variants, but also from current sorts of rationalist method in moral philosophy. Notably, the focus of all these issues, which determine the character of Kant's distinctive moral rationalism, is how Kant conceives of what he calls common moral rational cognition, gemeinsittliche Vernunfterkenntnis. In order to highlight the distinctive features of Kant's approach, I shall first consider its distortion by introducing what I take to be a highly influential misunderstanding of his approach, and then discussing two main outcomes of it. Kant's own position shall appear, hopefully more clearly, by contrast. The misunderstanding goes back to Sidgwick, at least. Although in the later editions of the Methods of Ethics, Sidgwick declared that, along with Mill, Kant had been his main inspiration, he, in fact, did not devote to Kant a detailed specific treatment, either in the methods themselves or in the outlines of the history of ethics. The background for his rather scattered critical observation on Kant, however, lies in the general idea that Kant is to be regarded as an intuitionist, or as Sidgwick writes, an intuitional moralist, whose views are, in many important respects, close to Samuel Clarke's and Richard Price's. In this light, Kant is presented as a rationalist of a rather traditional sort. With regard to methodological issues, Sidgwick regarded Kant as one of those writers who, quote, have been seeking among commonly received moral rules for genuine intuitions of the practical reason. In Sidgwick's view, this entails that Kant embraced the task of attaining to real ethical axioms by a more profound and discriminating examination of our common moral thought. On Sidgwick's understanding, thus, Kant is in fact assuming that moral criteria are in place and they are just like ordinary people conceive of them. While Sidgwick did not develop this reading of Kant, other authors adopted it in even clearer terms. A prominent case in point is W.D. Ross, who presented this idea of the proper method of moral philosophy, interlacing it with essentially the same understanding of Kant's view as Sidgwick. Ross namely argued that, quote, the moral convictions of thoughtful and well-educated people are the data of ethics, just as sense perceptions are the data of natural science. Accordingly, Ross explained this approach as follows. I propose to take as my starting point the existence of what I commonly called the moral consciousness, and by this I mean the existence of a large body of beliefs and convictions to the effect that there are certain kinds of acts that ought to be done and certain kinds of things that ought to be brought into existence, so far as we can bring them into existence. Only a few lines below, Ross refers to the preface of the groundwork to declare that Kant's method was the same, literally, as that which he had just sketched, observing that in the groundwork Kant again and again returns to that common knowledge as to that on which his theory is based and by comparison with which it must from time to time be tested. What I shall call, for brevity's sake, the Sidgwickian misunderstanding, thus consists in the assumption that Kant assumes as starting point in moral philosophy the intuitions or beliefs that characterize common sense morality, developing from an examination of commonly acknowledged moral rules or criteria. Neither Sidgwick nor Ross developed this thought at great length with regard to Kant. Nevertheless, this way of reading Kant's project has enjoyed an enduring influence in the interpretation of Kant's moral philosophy. The appeal of Sidgwickian misunderstanding has a twofold ground. First, this understanding seems to match, or at least to resonate with, Kant's appeal to common moral or rational cognition, as he calls it in the groundwork. And this has been mostly taken to mean that Kant bases his inquiry on moral common sense, that is, the basic moral convictions that most human beings appear to share. That's just an except for from the current Kant scholarship. He would thus proceed from what are supposed to be, again, a quote from interpreters, common sense ideas about goodwill, the function of human reason and duty. Or another example, Kant infers back from some common beliefs and practices to the principle on which the former rest. He would thus rely on commonly held moral beliefs, not unlike Aristotle and Mill, or so many interpreters contend. In this light, the starting point of current moral philosophy would be provided by common moral convictions, or more precisely, again a quote, reflective normative convictions that are generally shared, at least implicitly, and that he considers to be essentially correct. Along similar lines, another commentator remarks, much like Aristotle, therefore, Kant may be read, up to this point, up to the end of groundwork 2, as working within a pre-existing moral framework. Well, in spite of the differences with regard to almost any other issue, this understanding of Kant's project thus enjoys an unusually widespread consensus among the commentators. Second reason of the appeal of the misunderstanding, the thought expressed in it fits well also with a fundamental methodological assumption on current debates, namely that moral philosophy should base its inquiry on the moral intuitions of rational subjects. The underlying thought is that a moral theory cannot avoid a dialogue with pre-philosophical moral thinking, and that it must vindicate its claims by showing their general coherence. Interpreting Kant along these lines thus allows an easy dialogue, or is supposed to allow an easier dialogue between its view and those present in the current debates. In spite of its appeal, the Sidgwickian way of understanding Kant's method misrepresents it, obscuring its distinctive feature. To be fair, no one of the interpreters that I referred to in the 1 minute ago develops a Sidgwickian reading all the way, suggesting Kant grounds his view exclusively on the moral outlook of 18th century Europeans. Some commentators, for instance, hasten to add that it would be misleading to interpret common moral rational cognition as nothing more than a fundamentally, though ultimately contingent, understanding of morality. Although they do not go all the way in reading Kant as referring to a certain body of moral notions. However, these interpreters characterize what Kant means by common moral rational cognition in terms significantly different from Kant's own. Following the Sidgwickian misunderstanding, crucial distinctions are missed. To clarify my claim, I shall briefly consider in turn two different ways to develop this kind of understanding. Well, a first way to understand the starting point of moral philosophy, according to the XII thought, is to regard the acknowledged moral convictions of common sense morality as the proper basis for an investigation, the foundations of moral standards. More precisely, it is assumed that common sense morality rests on self-evident principles which every moral agent recognizes as valid. This is the path taken by pre-Kantian moral rationalists like Price or Reid. Reid, for instance, describes the evidence for the moral principles of common sense as irresistible or intuitive. Reid, therefore, was of the opinion that it is not very difficult or not a very demanding task to come by knowledge of ethical first principles. Brief quote from Reid: "Every man of common understanding knows certainly, and without reasoning, the ultimate ends he ought to pursue. Reasoning is necessary only to discover the most proper means of attaining them." In this conception, common sense morality rests on acts of cognition that consist in a non-inferential and non-perceptual rational insight. As such, they do not need a foundation in a higher order principle, which an intuitionist view regards as inaccessible or practically irrelevant. The principles of common sense morality, so understood, are thought of as directly available to reason and conscience. Sidgwick considers Kant close to Price in this respect, and some recent commentators also understand Kant's conception of common moral rational cognition in terms of rational insight. However, can't be read in similar terms only if some of his statements on the advantages of common moral cognition, in contrast to theoretical knowledge, are read too optimistically. Kant famously maintains that the common understanding often judges more correctly concerning matters of morality and duty than does the speculative. And there are many, many places where he maintains something like that. Such remarkable claims, however, do not equate to maintaining that ordinary moral cognition is per se trustworthy as a body of valid convictions. Thereby, Kant does not suggest that the only obstacles that make moral choices difficult are the difficulty of finding out the proper means to pursue the evident moral ends, as Reid holds, and the confusion deriving from wrong-headed philosophical accounts of morality. In fact, Kant never suggests that common moral rational cognition provides self-evident claims that only need to be distinguished from claims originating from other sources. In general, Kant never considers rational intuitions as the proper basis for philosophical investigation. He never has in view principles that can be found as such in common moral cognition, as if finding them were sufficient to realize the task of moral philosophy and to the practical purpose of moral life. To put it bluntly, for Kant there is no such thing as a self-evident synthetic claim, either in theoretical or in practical matters. If some non-tautological propositions appear to be candidates for the status of self-evident principles, they are in fact candidates for a justification through a Kantian deduction, which can only confirm them as synthetic a priori claims. As a passage from the Analytical Principles in the First Critique puts it, quote, "If we were to allow that synthetic propositions, no matter how evident they might be, could claim unconditional acceptance without any deduction, merely on their own claim, then all critique of the understanding would be lost. And since there is no lack of audacious pretensions that common belief does not refuse, which is, however, no credential, our understanding will therefore be open to every delusion, without being able to deny its approval to those claims that, though unjustifiable, demand to be admitted as actual axioms in the very same confident tone." End of quote. When we deal with propositions of beliefs of this sort, Kant writes, then for such a proposition, if not a proof, then at least a deduction of the legitimacy of its assertion must unfailingly be supplied. Quite the same holds true in moral philosophy. Kant does not start off from self-evident claims, since he, unlike Reid, does not believe that there are specific axioms of virtue that every moral subject unfailingly acknowledges. Against common sense philosophers, Kant held that common moral cognition urgently needed the investigation provided by moral philosophers, even though it did provide an indispensable basis for that investigation. I shall come back to that later. A second way to understand Kant's moral philosophy according to the Sedgwickian thought is to regard as the proper basis for an investigation what we nowadays call moral intuitions. More precisely, this possible way of reading Kant assumes that common sense morality is characterized by a body of generally shared beliefs or attitudes that emerge in response to particular cases. If we talk of moral intuitions, we roughly mean that the common accepted understanding of morality includes specific beliefs about the moral worth of some action type, about the proper moral reaction to specific circumstances, or about a certain character trait that should be approved of. Drawing on such materials, so goes the basic idea, it should be possible to put together a sort of pattern that eventually would lead to a comprehensive picture of what morality means, which is already implicit in our common thinking. If the first way to develop the Sedgwickian misunderstanding is representative of the similarities and the differences between Kant's view and pre-Kantian versions of moral rationalism, the second way of reading Kant suggests that he could be regarded as one of the noble fathers of the modern approach through intuitions, in a significant continuity with current debates. In spite of the similarities of the talk of moral intuitions with Kant's methodological remarks in the groundwork, Kant does not really proceed along these lines, though. Let me clarify what I take to be the crucial difference. It is notoriously controversial what is exactly meant with the current talk of moral intuitions, if a common ethical judgment widely shared between thinkers in a certain domain, a spontaneous judgment often concerning a particular act or agent, or a considered judgment. The most likely candidate for applying the intuition talk to Kant's views are, I would say, reflective normative convictions, or considered moral judgments, as some commentators have suggested. We could even try to define a specific Kantian sense of the notion of moral intuition, trying to match both Kant's conceptual vocabulary and the underlying thought of the method of referring to intuitions. However we define intuition, though, a fundamental difference with Kant's own approach remains in place. The appeal to intuitions works on the assumption that they are characterized by an independent credibility that makes them reliable. On the contrary, if Kant refers to intuitions expressed in ordinary moral thinking, he considers them not per se authoritative. In fact, for Kant, they can be wrong, even often so, as self-love can condition any moral belief. This is precisely why the need for a firm, clear standard of moral judgment is so urgent. This need, in turn, makes a philosophical investigation necessary, and specifically a philosophical investigation that follows an unempiricist method, that is, a pure moral philosophy. The kind of reading that I am posing here is sometimes encouraged by the assumption that Kant holds that common moral thinking is self-sufficient. This, however, is, I contend, a further misunderstanding of Kant's project, which aims not just at saving moral common sense against bad philosophical accounts, but first and foremost at saving common moral cognition from itself, and from the distortion that lead to bad philosophical accounts, which makes the struggle even harder. In Kant's view, ordinary moral thinking does require justification. Two very different conceptions of core moral thinking, and its correctness conflict here, thus. The contents of ordinary moral thinking, even purported Kantian intuitions, provide no justifying evidence against which the claims of moral theory are to be validated. This attempt would arguably boil down to derive morality from examples, to put it in the terms of groundwork 2. Kant does not share an essential component of what is nowadays called methodological rationalism, namely that intuitions are justifying without requiring justification. The role of ordinary moral thinking in Kant's method, therefore, cannot be directly justificatory. Kant's conception is thus also at odds with what is currently taken to be the closest thing to a shared method in moral philosophy, that is, reflective equilibrium. Very briefly put, this method amounts to a critical assessment of the moral beliefs that we have as a whole, as to their, a critical assessment of the moral beliefs that we have as to their consistency and their capacity to be fruitfully applied as a whole. Their practical implications are examined by considering how they accommodate particular instances or cases, how they relate to one another, and revising them to achieve a greater overall coherence among them. If on the one hand, this approach is modeled after the construction of an organized set of theoretical beliefs, aiming at consistency and adequacy of their objects, on the other hand, the procedure of reflective equilibrium is more similar to a pragmatic adjustment of beliefs that does not even need to assume that, as Rawls writes, there is one correct moral cognition, one correct moral conception. Such a procedure cannot be but successive, that is, empirical and a posteriori. Nevertheless, some commentators, again, have suggested that something close to this idea of a systematization of moral beliefs must take place in the groundwork. On such a reading, the confirmation of the validity of the moral theory through the appeal to common moral cognition, to which Kant alludes, would consist in the correspondence of the normative consequences of the formulae of the categorical imperative with commonly recognized duties, which thereby attain confirmation through systematic coherence. This is a further notable outcome of interpreting Kant's appeal to common moral cognition along Sedgwickian lines, of course. Some passages apparently suggest something of the kind. For instance, when Kant writes that, quote, human reason, even in the commonest understanding, can easily be brought to a high measure of correctness and accuracy, Richtigkeit und Ausführlichkeit, in moral matters. Kant writes, indeed, that what lies in the common use of practical reason must be brought to light and unraveled. That cannot but reject the project of a mere systematization of moral intuitions, however, should be clear by the end of groundwork 1. The task of moral philosophy cannot merely consist in, quote, presenting the system of morals more completely and accessibly, and likewise its rule in a form more convenient for use and still more for disputation, because the common use of practical reason and the moral beliefs arising from it are prone to what Kant calls in that very passage a natural dialectic. The influence of inclinations and self-love threatens every instance of moral reasoning, that is, every piece of common moral cognition. Because of this fundamental weakness, common moral cognition as such cannot provide reliable materials for a comprehensive systematization, but only basic evidence for a fundamental principle. From this constitutive frailty of common moral rational cognition arises the practical need for a philosophical inquiry. The project of obtaining a reflective equilibrium of common moral beliefs is thus at odds with Kant's view, because it draws on the same fundamental assumption that characterizes the appeal to intuition. Reflective equilibrium does include a corrective moment, of course, as it aims at rejecting beliefs and intuitions that do not cohere with the others, but this correction can only happen in virtue of the justifying nature of factually accepted moral beliefs, taken as a whole. Unlike in Kant's conception, the contents of common sense morality directly vindicate themselves as they cohere with each other. Again, this assumption does not match Kant's claim of the fundamental frailty of ordinary moral thinking. So next step, the difficulties of the two ways of developing the Sedgwickian misunderstanding show the importance of a correct interpretation of what Kant holds to be the proper starting point for his investigation. Since misconstruing it, it has a crucial impact on our appreciation of his entire project. In contrast to the two variants of the Sedgwickian misunderstanding, I propose to interpret Kant's common moral rational cognition in terms of a non-doxastic conception of ordinary moral thinking. Common sense morality, or common moral thinking, is mostly thought of in doxastic terms. That is defined in terms of the moral beliefs that rational beings actually entertain. Ordinary moral thinking thus consists in a certain body of convictions about morality that are supposed to be widely, if not universally, shared, or are empirically proven to be widely shared. This body of beliefs can be defined in more abstract or more minimal terms, of course, in order to avoid the risk to simply mirror the contingent convictions of a certain historical community. Both rational intuitionists and the current analysts of moral intuitions adopt a fundamentally doxastic conception, of course. This does not hold for Kant, I contend. Rather than in specific reflective beliefs about morality, the common moral rational cognition that he focuses on lies in the exercise of the capacity to entertain such beliefs, assess them, discuss them, trying to justify them, and take them as a guide to action. Even if we point out that Kant refers to commonly accepted examples of duty, that is another interpreter, I'm quoting from, we are going a bit too far, as this suggests that what matters to Kant is the actual convergence of normative convictions about some action types. On the contrary, I would suggest, Kant's investigation focuses on the constitutive elements of the shared capacity to recognize, access, and maybe even reject such convictions that emerge in the analysis. Now, understanding Kant's common moral rational cognition in non-doxastic terms allows to explain two features of his approach that other readings are, I suggest, not able to account for. That is, one, the ability to allow room for critical distance towards specific moral beliefs, and two, the ability to point out an evidential basis in common moral thinking that does not rule out, in fact stresses, its need of a corroboration. So first point of these two. Both ways of developing the Sidgwickian misunderstanding center on the contents of ordinary moral thinking, in particular intuitions, as both refer to a purported knowledge of particular demands taken as valid. If this knowledge is assumed as a starting point of the investigation, the space for revision and criticism of those demands is rather narrow. It seems that the examination can at best partially revise the contents of the moral beliefs on which the inquiry is based. On the contrary, I should like to stress the hidden reformism in Kant's moral philosophy, which is actually not so much hidden as not so clearly grasped. A crucial difference separating Kant's method from the appeal to moral intuitions and acknowledged moral convictions is that on Kant's approach, no piece of common moral cognition is to be preserved per se. The remark that philosophy can never even think of providing a new principle of morality, but only a new formula of it, is too often read as an entirely optimistic statement, to the effect that pre-philosophical moral thinking already enjoys valid principles and can stay content with them. This is not what Kant maintains, though. Even if it does not come up with a brand new principle, critical moral philosophy still provides a new formula of it, which in important respects corrects not only competing philosophical accounts, but also widespread conceptions. In this spirit, the opening pages of the groundwork, groundwork 1, of course, present a first correction of widespread yet erroneous moral beliefs, which are not merely philosophical claims. Kant deems it necessary to rectify deeply rooted moral convictions. In his view, thus, moral philosophy does not have just a merely restorative function about ordinary moral thinking, but also not merely the task of clarifying the stringency of moral demands. In fact, the first task is to contest some elementary moral beliefs, even the most basic of them, namely that happiness determines the moral standard. Kant's rejection of this conviction cannot be read as a merely academic matter of dispute, and Kant certainly did not see it as such. For Kant, the chief aim of philosophical investigation is not that at least some of the moral beliefs that we find in common moral cognition are established as valid. In principle, it might well be that an accepted moral code is found to be largely misguided and contains mostly wrong precepts. Kant's approach allows a space for criticism of even widespread moral views, as a certain corrective attitude in his examination of morality is most often entirely overlooked, in particular with regard to the supposedly traditional ethics of the doctrine of virtue. That late work, in fact, provides many remarkable examples of some rectification of some shared moral beliefs, for instance about lying, honor, respect, suicide, honesty. Kant's attitude is not so different, in fact, from Hume's in criticizing specific moral convictions, that is, particular putative virtues, like the so-called monkish virtues. Humility is a case in point, of course. Kant's moral philosophy thus includes a reformist attitude towards common moral convictions that should not be underplayed. Understanding Kant as aiming at making commonly held moral beliefs consistent misses this remarkable counterfactual attitude in his moral thought. It might well be that no available specific moral conviction is entirely right as it is understood and practiced. For this reason, precisely for this reason, we need an assessment criterion and a compass for finding good maxims. Even if many shared beliefs are eventually proven to be right or justified, they are not to be considered direct substantive evidence for defining moral standards. In this respect, Kant's formulations might cause some confusion. He often insists that the primary task of philosophical investigations of morality must be to bring obscure concepts to light. Like Sidgwick, here thereby refers to the Socratic idea of analysis. This way of presenting the task, however, suggests to Kant a somewhat misleading metaphor. He sometimes represents the aim of investigating the obscure notions using the metaphor of a light that illuminates dark areas on a map. In this case, Kant's metaphor veils or fails to properly convey the critical part of the task. If pure moral philosophy is needed, it is not just because the fundamental moral standard is not transparent and thus often ineffective, but because there are within ordinary moral thinking conflicting notions of specific moral demands and their implications, which yield a normative confusion that can be overcome only by pointing out a higher standard. Second point, both variants of the Sidgwickian misunderstanding imply that ordinary moral thinking provides substantive evidence for moral theory, that is, valid normative contents. On the reading that I am proposing, Kant's view importantly differs. The common moral cognition that he appeals to does not provide contents that are supposed to fit with one another in a general picture of morality like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, but provides evidence of principles instead. When he develops a first formulation of the moral law starting out from the notion of a goodwill going through the concept of duty, Kant is drawing on a criterion of judgment that imposes the self, a genuine, that is, as a general formal criterion that enables to access specific beliefs concerning the worth of some action type or character trait. The philosophical analysis in groundwork 1 obtains thereby a principle that moral cognition of common human reason, if it does not think of it as separated in this way in a universal form, yet always actually has before its eyes and uses as the standard of its judging. That was, of course, a quote from Groundwork 1. The elements brought to light through analysis are thus not moral convictions that Kant holds to be true or even self-evident. By looking into how common moral rational cognition works, Kant does not discover specific convictions that pass some test of validity, for which no criterion would be available at this stage. He instead reveals a criterion, or as he writes, a compass, which provides a guide to orientation among different moral beliefs. Kant remarks that with this compass in hand, common reason, quote, knows very well how to distinguish in every case that comes up what is good and what is evil, what is in conformity with duty or contrary to duty. Common moral cognition provides to the philosopher not beliefs in need of testing, but an implicit, even if unheard of, principle, which the philosopher has to bring to light. This explains why even wrong moral beliefs and judgments count as evidence of sorts, as the case of the most hardened scoundrel, the ex-te Bösewicht, shows. Remarkably, Kant does not appeal to residual acceptable moral beliefs of the scoundrel, but to his capacity to pass judgment on cases of moral behavior, when one presents him with examples of probity or purpose, and so on. In Kant's view, the exercise of practical reason in moral matters always expresses in its pure formal elements the basic criteria of morality, even if they can be twisted or disfigured as soon as specific rules are formulated or particular choices are made. The non-doxastic reading of common moral rational cognition that I am proposing furthermore shows also a deep correspondence in the general strategy of the groundwork and the second critique. In this slide, despite significant structural differences, both works follow the same underlying thought of an analytical investigation of ordinary moral judgments. In 1787, Kant makes clearer than before that no specific moral beliefs or even certain moral values, but principles must be regarded as the starting point of moral inquiry. If in the critique the explicit mention of common moral rational cognition has not the pride place that it enjoys in the groundwork, the overall argument of the critique develops an investigation that is not about an analysis of the basic uncontroversial elements of accepted moral demands, but about clarifying the formal constituents of the moral principle entailed in every judgment on moral matters. Those constituents are precisely what analytical pure practical reason isolates: the fundamental law as a categorical imperative, the concept of good in nomologic terms, respect for the law as a moral incentive. What matters to philosophical investigation into common moral cognition are judgments which point to criteria, that is, principles, that can thereby be recognized. The proper basis for the investigation lies in that, as Kant writes in the second critique, the most common understanding can distinguish without instruction, again, what form in a maxim makes it fit for a giving of a universal law and what does not. The data thus provided by the common use of practical reason are not the factual evidence of actually accepted beliefs, but, as Kant writes, examples of reason judging morally. As Kant writes in the second critique, looking back at the overall argument, we can analyze them, that's a quote from the second critique, we can analyze them into their elementary concepts and adopt a procedure similar to that of chemistry, and come to know both of them pure and what each can accomplish of itself. Instead of providing data to be combined in a coherent picture, common moral rational cognition makes available a reactive material in which it is necessary to isolate formal elements that express the basic structure of pure practical reason, independently from the contingent moral judgments that the subjects happen to accept. This is the whole point of the project of a pure practical philosophy, after all. There is nothing specifically different here from the reflective awareness of the validity of the principle of pure understanding through judgments of experience. Importantly, the starting point adopted by Kant is not essentially characterized in first-personal terms. Every moral judgment passed on action, both first-personal and third-personal, leads common moral cognition to become aware of its constitutive standards. The awareness of the moral law is thus easily attained within common moral cognition. In Kant's view, if examples as such cannot supply a criterion for moral judgment, they do show that such a criterion is needed to access the case at hand, precisely because examples imply a reference to a criterion by which morality can be judged. They can help to show that the required prototype always resides only in reason. Examples call for judgment that employ the standard looked for and make it explicit. In this vein, the groundwork does not praise the trustworthiness of particular moral beliefs rooted in ordinary moral thinking, but rather differently, the subtlety of the ordinary use of practical reason in discerning moral from non-moral incentives. Unlike doxastic conceptions, Kant's approach is better understood as drawing not on a purely factual basis of moral beliefs, but on what is always attainable in judgments on actions. The focus on the practice of moral appraisal makes Kant's approach closer to sentimentalist predecessors than to prior rationalists. Hume, more clearly Smith, focused their endeavors in moral philosophy on how to account for the ability to approve or disapprove of actions and motives that is distinctive of moral subjects. In other words, they also have some sort of non-doxastic view or ordinary moral thinking. Their investigations do not assume shared moral beliefs as factual evidence to be built upon, but as a phenomenon to be explained. The crucial difference to Kant is, of course, that they elaborate on the underlying thought that moral appraisal is primarily an affection, as it has to do with pleasure and pain, with the capacity to share these feelings through the dynamics of sympathy, whereas Kant's analysis of ordinary moral thinking is developed in terms of rational cognition. Last point, a further important consequence of the Sidgwickian misunderstanding in both its outcomes, finally, is that it obscures Kant's aim in moral philosophy by over-intellectualizing his entire project. The thought that investigation by moral philosophers must build on common moral intuition leads to regard the systematization of those intuitions as the main goal. If moral intuitions provide material analogous to pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, the straightforward task is to assemble them together. This does not hold true for Kant, however, unlike Sidgwick and many other people, in virtue of his non-doxastic conception of ordinary moral thinking. However, also in his view, the needed validation of the principle of morality must still take place with regard to ordinary moral thinking. While the current assumption is that the theory is validated if and only if it accommodates essential contents of ordinary moral thinking, Kant's leading thought is not that some notion fits into a body of validated beliefs or otherwise is rejected, but that the proposed principle of morality matches the basic structure that emerges in ordinary moral judgments. In the preface to the groundwork, Kant explains that his strategy shall bring the examination of the principle and its sources back to the common cognition in which we find it used. That is, back to the ordinary use of practical reason, in considering possible or actual moral cases. So the primary aim of the inquiry should be the identification and corroboration, the Aufsuchung und Festsetzung of the supreme principle of morality. The former notion in this twofold aim is rather perspicuous and not especially problematic. Identifying the principle of morality is the goal of the analysis carried out in groundwork 1 and 2. The second distinctive term of Kant's formulation is unfortunately less clear. It is customary to understand corroboration, Festsetzung, as referring to the deduction of the moral law that groundwork 3 should provide. On such a reading, Kant's statement is thus taken to mean that the ultimate goal of his investigation is to deliver a philosophical argument that makes a philosophical point against philosophical adversaries. Such a reading, however, misses a substantial part of the purpose. In the groundwork, Kant had already stated that common human reason is impelled to leave its sphere not by some need of speculation but rather on practical grounds. Clarifying the role of ordinary moral rational cognition is essential. The moral principle is identified and secured once A, the principle is found, and B, is shown to match a fundamental assumption of the ordinary use of practical reason. As to the second task, the doctrinal method of the second critique elaborates further the very same methodological assumptions of groundwork 3. The distinction that Kant draws in 1787 between the aim of a doctrinal method in theoretical and practical philosophy gives the clue for focusing on the practical use of common cognition instead of systematization. In Kant's formulation, the principle of morality must prove itself able of being made subjectively practical. The project first developed in the groundwork has a profoundly educative task. In the second critique, because it means to discipline our reason by making our nature moral subjects apparent to us. In the second critique, this feature of Kant's approach becomes more apparent as he presents exercises designed to bring the results of his analysis back to moral cognition, precisely. The exercises presented in the doctrinal method reveal to the participants of the exercises their nature of subjects able to pass judgment on moral cases and enlighten them about the validity of the principle that they make use of. If it were impossible for every moral subject to discover in his or her moral reasoning through exercises and reflection on examples the moral law as his or her law, the moral law should then really be regarded as a mere victim of the imagination, as a mere Hirngespinst, as the threat is presented in the groundwork. Through guided reflection on the judgment we pass on examples, we can show that our faculty of reason has a pure use, separate from its empirically conditioned use. In the terms of the groundwork, the proper corroboration, the proper Festsetzung of the principle happens only within ordinary moral thinking by recognizing the moral law as subjectively practical. In this light, in contrast with an understanding of Kant's project centered on an over-intellectualized interpretation of the starting point of the inquiry, Kant's own method for moral philosophy has a primary practical nature that matches his non-doxastic conception of ordinary moral cognition. Moral philosophy as such has a primarily practical aim that at the same time also targets philosophical adversaries, insofar as their principles are expressions of the same weakness that affects common moral cognition. Very quickly, my concluding remarks. Kant's distinctive moral rationalism can helpfully be characterized in contrast with the outcomes of the Sidgwickian claim, or so I've argued. Kant's own view, thus, is neither aimed at attaining a reflective equilibrium of intuitions, nor is centered on direct evidence of some basic demands of morality. That is, it's not intuitionist like previous rationalist views. In general, it is not a version of rationalism centered on particular contents or the privileged access to particular beliefs. Despite the crucial differences from those conceptions of ordinary moral thinking, Kant's view is a different form of rationalism, insofar as it follows from the rationalist assumption that the ultimate source of moral criteria is not to be found anywhere out of human reason. Kant's own approach is best construed, as I have argued, as based on a non-doxastic conception of ordinary moral thinking in terms of the practical use of reason. This reading, I suggest, sheds light on some crucial feature of Kant's strategy, both in the groundwork and the second critique, in particular with regard to the character of their aim. And finally, since it does not understand the basis for Kant's inquiry in terms of doxastic contents, the interpretation I propose leaves the space for a reformist aspect of Kant's approach and this necessary critical attitude towards particular moral demands and accepted moral codes. Thank you so much for your attention.
Пожалуйста, вопросы. Yes, please go ahead. But I'll give you the microphone.
Thank you for the talk. I think it was very good and very clear. I wonder if I could invite you to tell us a bit more about the contrast between the doxastic and the non-doxastic. Not only because I think that plays quite a sort of significant role in the structure of your argument, but also because I think there might be a worry that if we push the non-doxastic model too far, then we might end up with something that does not amount to cognition, properly speaking, right? Morally. So yeah. Mm-hmm. So then again, just a clarification on the distinction between the doxastic and the non-doxastic.
Should I answer directly? Or? Okay. So yes. Well, thanks so much for your question. Is very helpful, very crucial, of course, very central. I'm not entirely sure I really understand your worry. The idea is basically that you have at least two fundamentally different options to understand common sense morality. One doxastic, some people say a dispositional way to understand it. I just think dispositional doesn't really fit into Kant's conception because of, inappropriate connections or resonances. The basic idea should be that in one case you can rely on valid contents to be built upon. You already have your answers, you already have specific answers to moral problems, to moral issues. On the other hand, you have a capacity to address moral issues. And what you have is, of course, again and again, a form of cognition. in terms of judgments, of course, of concrete judgments, you are in principle able to pass on your actions or other people's actions. Well, it's you could say, and I would totally agree with that, it's just a different way to put the general idea of formalism and a priori structures and so on in place. But that's precisely my point. I mean, I just didn't have the time to develop that idea because, I mean, oddly enough, it is customary to highlight and to stress these features in Kant's account without paying attention to the consequences, to how we interpret these very fundamental claims. And as I mentioned in the first part of my paper, you hardly find interpreters who make some distinctions here. So, thank you so much.
Thank you. I think I have a follow-up probably to this one. Mm-hmm. And my question is, would you accept, after all, that you've said in criticism, that it's still a matter of, that there is an evidential connection between ordinary morality, if there is such a thing, and Kant's moral theory, which would be a bit more indirect? At a couple of points in your talk, you said ordinary moral thought isn't direct evidence, or you said it isn't substantial evidence. And it would seem to me that that's quite compatible with saying, and I think you said something to that effect, that it's still very important to, as it were, read off some structure like the moral law from ordinary moral thought. All that would require is that a substantial part or a particular kind of structure in moral thought is recognized, and then the philosopher comes in, clarifies it, investigates what are the preconditions and what other assumptions are involved and so on. And that will be compatible with, as you have emphasized again, quite fundamental revisions in ordinary moral thought, because you finally have a structure and then you can go to work with it, as it were. But it would still seem that you can say, and I just wanted to check if that is what you wanted to say, that there is that indirect link and that there is, in that way, an evidential connection between ordinary moral thought and moral theory, even on Kant's picture. Right.
Yes, well, thanks for your point. I was indeed trying to suggest something like this when I mentioned, or when I said that Kant seems to conceive of ordinary moral thinking as providing evidence of principles. I just didn't stress this idea that much, as opposed to, of course, direct determined moral evidence as to its content. Yeah? Evidence of principles, well, it's, as I mentioned before, the case of the scoundrel, of the Bösewicht. It's interesting, and I think it's strategically important for Kant there, 454 in the groundwork 3, to show that even without being able to refer to the direct evidence of correct moral beliefs, I mean, the scoundrel is precisely a bad person who has morally bad ideas, just roughly put. I mean, still you have the opportunity to bring to light something. You have evidence for it, which is a principle of judgment. That's the basic idea. So the very fundamental contrast is to be put this way. Thank you so much.
Так, вот вы сказали в своем докладе, что именно применение морального кодекса Канта, она как бы основана на преодолении противоречий, которые возникают на неких интуициях здравого смысла. На их преодоление уже в рациональном опыте морали, насколько я вас правильно понял. Не считаете ли вы, что подобные условия являются условием для спекулятивной легитимизации репрессивного отношения по отношению к онтологически иначе организованным рациональным субъектам, которые формируют, могут формировать другие моральные императивы.
Okay. Yes. Thank you so much for your question. I'm not entirely sure I was able to understand it, so I'm trying to answer it, and then we can probably adjust our dialogue and in further stages. I mean, the idea, or I take Kant to be suggesting that the basic problem that you have with commonly held moral judgment, moral beliefs and moral intuitions is that they are fundamentally frail and subject to conditioning by self-love in the first place, and by a whole lot of other external conditions, actually. So they cannot provide direct material, directly available material, directly trustworthy material to be built upon. On the other hand, the same subjects, of course, say the subjects who live in a community based on fundamentally wrong moral convictions, are still able to draw on the fundamental principle of pure practical reason, and after clarifying it, develop a different moral code and criticize their previous moral convictions. Okay. But as I said, I'm not entirely sure I was going in the right direction of answering your question.
So, experimental philosophy have shown that actually intuitions aren't a very reliable source of knowledge, and perhaps it's wrong to treat them as self-evident claims or something like that. Mm-hmm. So I wonder whether actually experimental philosophy and appeal to it can be used as a source of support of this non-doxastic interpretation. I mean, not the support that this is correct interpretation of what Kant means, but that the support that it's a better kind of interpretation, in that sense that it avoids criticisms from experimental philosophy, the very same criticisms to which I think Cedrician reading is very, very vulnerable. What do you think?
Mm-hmm. So yes, thanks so much. I was kind of expecting such a question, because I mean I was basically referring to this kind of debate when I was talking about intuitions in the current sense, of course. I mean, I would be inclined to accept support from any direction, even from experimental philosophers. Still, as you know, it's not always entirely clear what the role of intuition. There is actually a huge debate on this in the last 10 years or so. Which role intuition should play even within experimental philosophy. And actually, as far as I know, you certainly know more than I do about this, as far as I know, most experimental philosophers do apply to some intrinsic fundamental trustworthiness of intuitions and convictions and beliefs, and the philosophers that were more inclined to work with intuitions and to appeal to intuitions are also inclined to assume that they have a justificatory power, which in Kant's case just do not apply. But still, if you can think of an experimental moral philosophy in Kantian terms as a kind of, a new sort of Kantian practical anthropology, well, I'm more than happy to be able to provide further evidence. But it has to be evidence, as I said, in non-doxastic terms. Otherwise, it violates the entire outlook of Kant's conception. So, thanks so much.